my hope in what this statement was developed by both boards, what it does is that it actually represents where the majority of people in the EFCA already are. But that way it takes away the fear of, are we on this slippery slope or that slippery slope? And where is the EFCA going? And on things that we're not going anywhere on these issues.
We're standing firmly on biblical truth and the gospel of Jesus Christ. Well, in recent months, both the Board of Directors and the Board of Ministerial Standing approved a document which was shared at the General Conference of the EFCA this past summer. The document is Where We Stand in the EFCA, Denials and Affirmations. Now, in this conversation that we have today, we'll talk to the chairpersons of each board and highlight the importance of this document for the EFCA. We're very pleased to have Bill Riedel, who chairs the Board of Directors, and Dave Linde, who chairs the Board of Ministerial Standing, with us. Now, I will add this, that Dave has been ordained with us in the EFCA since 2005, and Bill since 2009. And so we're encouraged by that. But just as some groundwork, then lead into the next part of the interest of where your background, and that is share your ministry backgrounds and experiences, highlighting just your years of ministry in the EFCA. If let's see, Dave, if we would start with you, please, just give us a little background of your involvement in the EFCA.
So I came to the North Central District staff in the summer of 2001, so 22 years ago. And that came to me, actually, I was unawares. It came to me providentially. And I have served on the district staff with primary responsibilities in pastoral search and in credentialing. And it's been a really wonderful 22 years. I have loved it. I love the Free Church. I feel very much at home in the Free Church. And over the course of these years, it's been a blessing to me to serve congregations and pastors and church leaders in a variety of ways, including helping church leaders and pastors in the credentialing process.
Dave, if you would just, for a moment, how long have you been a part of the Board of Ministerial Standing?
10 years, and I've chaired the board for the last 2 years.
Yes, thank you. Bill, if you would give us a little bit of your history.
Yeah, I think I've been in an EFCA church since I was 10 years old or so. So that's about 33 years for me. So grew up in middle school, high school in an EFCA church. And then I went to Trinity for undergrad and seminary. And the whole time I was at Trinity, I interned at the same EFCA church I grew up in. After graduating from TEDS with the MDiv, I went on to a church in Indianapolis, Indiana, which was an EFCA church where I served with Tom Macy was my senior pastor there, and was there for 4.5 years or so. And that's where I completed my licensure and ordination. Shortly after becoming ordained, we made a long journey that landed us in Washington, D.C., where we planted a church. We were sent out by Cornerstone Church in Annandale, Virginia, which was led by Bill Kynes, who is a big part of Spiritual Heritage Committee and has been an important part of the EFCA. And so he became a spiritual father to me for the last 13 years. And we planted a church. We're right on Capitol Hill. I guess right now I'm sitting 4 blocks from the U.S. Capitol. And so when people ask if we're in the DC area, we're very much in DC. But that's, so along the way then, planted the church and have seen it grow and been a part of other church plants and planting, both in the EFCA and beyond. And I've been on the board of directors now for 4 years. And so that's a quick summary of a lot of years of involvement.
Yeah. And you've been chair, you've served in the role of chair, how long?
Just over a year now.
Wonderful. Great. Thank you. Well, in our last episode, just as a reminder, refresher, we discussed how the EFCA came to this moment in our ministry history. much has changed in the last decade in ministry and ministry contexts. And so what we looked at the last time was the cultural landscape and engaging contemporary issues and some of those issues that then in broader evangelicalism that impacted and broader American culture, how that impacted and brought us to this point of the denials and affirmations that we drafted and our president Kevin Compline read at the EFCA 1 or business conference, business session at the conference. And so we would like to pick that up and discuss the roles that the two boards played in the denials and affirmations. So if we would talk about some of the roles of Board of Ministerial Standing and the Board of Directors in how we function in the EFCA. We are congregational in our polity. So can we talk about the various roles and responsibilities of the two boards appointed and accountable, appointed by the conference and accountable to the conference? Bill, if we could begin with you and the Board of Directors.
Yeah, that I find in talking to people that very few people understand what the board of directors is.
I think you're right. I
I don't think I understood what it was and didn't know what I was agreeing to when I stepped onto it. And so about 4 years ago, I had a steep learning curve myself. So the board of directors is primarily responsible for oversight on the organizational and administrative aspects of the EFCA. And so we directly oversee the president, and through him, the rest of EFCA operations and Reach Global and Reach National. And so right in the EFCA bylaws, which they're right there. And so I guess I hadn't read the bylaws very carefully.
Many don't, my friend. Many don't.
Yes, in churches either, which is something that has to change. But the board of directors is commissioned to uphold the EFCA through prayer and to oversee the work of the EFCA on behalf of the conference to ensure doctrinal integrity and compliance to the statement of faith, to establish the goals and strategies for the EFCA and evaluate ministries in light of those goals and exercise fiscal responsibility. So really it's interaction on the organizational aspects of what we're doing as a denomination and accountability for the president in his work in leading all of the other moving pieces. And so that's the end that the board of directors is on. And in that I think we have the opportunity and responsibility to interact with other groups within the EFCA to try to make sure that good work is being done.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Bill. In other words, the conference delegates affirm board of directors members, and the board is in turn accountable to the conference delegates. And
yes.
And I think you're right that many don't understand how it functions, but it's there's intentionality and purpose behind all that's done. Dave Linde, if you would talk briefly about the Board of Ministerial Standing.
As the title of the board suggests, we our work has to do with the standing of ministers in the Free Church, and we are charged by the conference with overseeing, ensuring the doctrinal integrity and faithfulness of the ministers, the pastors within our movement, and also the ethical, moral integrity of pastors as well. So both doctrine and practice. And we could look at this from three different angles, I think. From an angle with respect to pastors and ministers in our movement who are not yet credentialed, either licensed or holding a certificate. The Board of Ministerial Standing attempts to, on an ongoing basis, resource, counsel, and encourage those pastors and ministers to obtain a credential. From the angle of those who are working their way through the process of licensing or certification, the Board of Ministerial Standing oversees that whole process. It's a three-legged stool that begins in the local church with the local church's commendation of the pastor. The districts administer the process, and the Board of Ministerial Standing has final sign-off on each credential And so the Board of Ministerial Standing ultimately reviews each licensing paper, each certification, ordination paper, and so on. So we oversee that. And then a third angle is from the standpoint of our boards helping or addressing pastors who, in one way or another, get into difficulty or get into trouble. That may be emotional difficulty in a difficult church. It may be doctrinal or moral difficulty and missteps. And then the Board of Ministerial Standing oversees a process of seeking to help them recover and get back on track.
So like the Board of Directors, the Board of Ministerial Standing is similarly approved by the conference delegates and is accountable to the conference delegates. And these are the two boards that are the only two boards in the EFCA that function in that way. And I think it's helpful for us to remind people of how we function, because I do think it's often not known, and often it's not known until it needs to be known, and then it can create some different kinds of questions or concerns. And so anyway, thank you both for serving as chairs of our two important boards in the EFCA. Well, in light of that, I'm just very interested.
Greg, let me just say a word. It might be helpful. The makeup of the Board of Ministerial Standing is significant as well. There are approximately a dozen members of the board, and they range from several pastors throughout the EFCA, two representatives of Trinity International University. Greg, you're on the board as an ongoing member of the board. There's a representative of the EFCA network, and the chaplains are represented, and so on. So it's a variety of ministries
and district superintendents.
Yep, exactly. 4 district superintendents. So it's really a wonderful mix.
Bill, did you want to add anything about the makeup at all?
Yeah, the board of directors is a fairly diverse group of people. We have, it varies somewhat, but I think it's in the neighborhood of 17 to 20 range on that board. And so it's a large board, but there's people from all kinds of different backgrounds. So we have a requirement on how many ordained pastors or credentialed pastors we need to have on the board of directors. But then also we recognize that pastors aren't the best ones to run every aspect of an organization. That's asking a little bit much. And so we have people with legal backgrounds and accounting backgrounds, business backgrounds, just a variety of fields, so that we get a variety of perspectives to try to make wise decisions. And so when we have we have committees like an audit committee, pastors usually aren't the first ones that are thrown onto the audit committee.
Right.
We have people with accounting and financial backgrounds, and so men and women. And so we really work toward and emphasize having a good mix of the right kinds of people at the table to be able to make good decisions.
And I think it also reflects the fact that although the board of directors is responsible for its statement of faith and all these other things, the specific and explicit responsibility of the board of ministerial standing is, as you mentioned, Dave, doctrinal integrity. And so that is the specific responsibility given to the Board of Ministerial Standing through the process of credentialing. Well, thank you for that clarification. Let's press in a little bit on the where we stand in the EFCA denials and affirmations. Talk a little bit about the origin. How did this begin? You know, in our last episode, we looked at some of the backdrop of our cultural landscape and evangelicalism and what's happening here the last decade that sort of prompted, just raised a number of questions. So what was the origin of our where we stand in the EFCA? How did it come to be? And then once we talk about that just briefly, we'll talk about some of the process and how that carried out in a board of directors and the board of ministerial standing, and then the end result that I think was very encouraging. So why don't we start, Bill, with you and just talk about some of the origin, and Dave, feel free to jump in as well as is fitting.
So back in April, we get regular theological updates from Greg. Comes in. So Greg, you've joined us a number of times, and this is one of the great things on the board of directors is there's always a focus on an educational component of what we do every time we meet, which is 4 times a year. And so in April, we had a theology update and a number of issues covered, but helpful for the board. But at that meeting, there was a real sense among the board that we are at an important moment for the EFCA, especially heading into the conference this past June. And so we've had our own challenges that warranted some clarification. That's what the introduction of the statement tries to clarify, is that these are questions asked, concerns raised, criticisms made about or against the EFCA. And so some of that was stuff within our movement, but also we've looked around and watched as other churches or whole denominations are getting caught up in these cultural issues that are dividing really deeply. And so it seems like people have a tendency to talk past each other on a lot of these things, and there's not even agreement on what the words mean or any kind of definitional clarity. That makes it hard because language just gets thrown around, and that gets compounded by the speed of the flow of information and in our day and the deepening political divides around us that are infiltrating into the church. And so there's a number of reasons that coming out of that time that we spent with you, that the board of directors had and you had shared just some basic of this idea of denial and affirmation. And so from that, we wanted to make it clear heading into the conference that what the EFCA is and what we aren't, that we won't be defined ultimately by any social movement, but we also need to recognize what's happening in the world around us and not put our head in the sand and just preach the gospel, as some say, because we're preaching the gospel into a context that people are wrestling with these issues. And so that was the origin then of what started out as forming a task force to see who would be the best to be in the room to try to work on a statement like this.
Yeah, thank you. That's very, very helpful. Dave, is anything you want to add to that?
In April, likewise, the Board of Ministerial Standing was discussing this same idea. In fact, we had discussed it back in February of 2023 at our meeting then. And I went back and looked, and I saw some email traffic that you and I had, Greg, about this idea back in November of 2022.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
And again, just as you said, Bill, the foment in culture in general, and that foment, seeping into churches, seeping into the free church in various ways with uncertainty and questions and so on. And I think there's just a mounting concern, on the part of many, that clarification would really be timely for the free church as a whole. Clarification on a sort of a slate of issues that are part of that foment. And so, and then after our April meetings, both the Board of Ministerial Standing and the Board of Directors, Bill, as you said, a task force was formed of Board of Directors folks and Board of Ministerial Standing folks. And there was a process then of drafting and redrafting and hammering out language and so on, which I found very helpful. I thought the collaborative effort was very, very fruitful.
Yeah. Bill, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I think that, even what Dave just said highlights what we were talking about the role of these two boards.
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
The board of directors, in my role as the chair, I was able to say, hey, this is something that we need to address and that we can put into the agenda for the upcoming conference because this is an important moment. But the board of directors shouldn't handle that on our own. And so getting the Board of Ministerial Standing involved to be a part of that doctrinal clarity, and the Spiritual Heritage Committee. That we had representation from the Spiritual Heritage Committee, which is a committee of the Board of Directors. And so the three groups, really the two boards with that, also that representation from that committee, but the two boards coming together on a task force gave us a diversity of people that the Board of Ministerial Standing, because there's a requirement for ordination.
Yes, right.
That can't quite have in the same way, but it did allow us then for the board of directors to kind of say, hey, this is something we would like to see addressed. The board of ministerial standing had raised it to us, and then to be able to work back and forth so that one board is keeping a stringent timeline to see if we can get this thing done in 5 weeks, while getting enough people to get input and interaction. And then from the task force, once we got to a final-ish draft from the task force, we had to put that out to the two boards, which are very different from each other, and got feedback they had a week to give us feedback. And then we came back and had a final draft that went to each board for each board to vote on it. And so coming to a point where we had a final draft that was approved by and affirmed by both boards was a big task, but the process really, I think, helped us to refine things to be at a really helpful place, and even to define what issues we were going to address along the way. And so I think the process actually was a beautiful representation of how this can function, though I don't know historically that the two boards have interacted all that much.
I would add to that because they have. I would say it's not that they have not, but this was historic for a number of reasons. But one of those is that the two boards had never presented a document or statement or where we stand in the EFCA to a conference in the past. So this was a first. Coming from the two boards, it did not carry conference authority, but it did carry a certain authority because these two boards are approved by the conference delegates, and they're accountable to the conference delegates. And so it wasn't as if it was insignificant. No, it didn't have the authority of the conference, but it did have some significant voice and authority within the context and the structure of the EFCA. So I think it was very, very timely. Talk just a little bit about if the sort of the cultural issues as we were thinking about this, were there specific theological or cultural or practical considerations that guided the crafting process? Were there, and Bill, you had mentioned just a little bit some of the cultural pressure points that we were feeling. Is there anything else in particular that we were thinking about processing regarding the theological, cultural, or practical issues that resulted in the statement that was drafted?
Yeah, I think that even we saw the interaction of the two boards was very helpful, because some of it, Board of Ministerial Standing has a finger on the pulse of the issues that people are wrestling with through their credentialing. And so one of the ones I've gotten asked about a number of times is the last of the bullet points on annihilationism. And, this feels out of place when you've got all these cultural issues that seem to be in a line, and then all of a sudden, wham, you get this theology of last states.
And especially, Bill, because it's actually in our statement of faith. I mean,
right.
we Article 10, we affirm eternal conscious punishment.
Yeah. And so, but knowing from the Board of Ministerial Standing that this is an issue that's coming up regularly. And I think that's one of the important points that's in the introduction of this, is that the issues that we listed are things that we have been pressed on, that questions are coming up regularly. And so they weren't just pulled out of thin air. And that's and we talked about this in the process, as soon as you decide to write something on some issues, there's an immediate question of, well, what about this one? And what about this one? And why didn't you do this one? And this wasn't meant to be an exhaustive statement. It was never the intent of that. But we did use flashpoint terms on purpose to be able to address things and try in a very short format to bring some definitional clarity. But again, that's where I think that the material around the 8 bullet points is probably more important than the bullet points themselves. That a lot of people are going to immediately have their eyes drawn to the bullets because you see Christian nationalists or woke, and it just draws your attention. But the material around it is what will last. I don't know if we're going to be talking about wokeness in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years, but we will be talking about whether or not we can affirm aspects of social movements that are existing in that moment, and what we can affirm and what we can deny, and where does the free church land, and how do we navigate? And so that aspect of posture is something that I think can really last.
I agree. And I think that not only is it important, it's true for local churches as well, that to respond in the moment, which is necessary. I mean, we, in many respects, you've got to preach a sermon come Sunday, and you can't, you don't have X number of months, to think about this. We've got a word to speak from God on Sunday, and so that's a reality. But there's also then, what are the things that we learn or are learning because it's going to happen again? So, what's the next thing? We don't know what necessarily the next thing will be, but we do know this: God has spoken. He has spoken definitively. And we then, as those entrusted with the gospel, we speak those truths and apply them into the present context and culture in which we live. And so it may not be, as you say, Bill, those bullet items that they had a short shelf life, but there will be another that we will, and that's been true through the history of the church, isn't it? So, Dave Linde, any other thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that one of the cultural influences, one of the cultural dynamics that is afoot and has been afoot for some time now in our society, and that has seeped into the church, actually influenced the overall format of this document, namely the denials and the affirmations, or as we say toward the end of the document, the sic et non, the yes and no. The trend in society is to see everything in black and white terms, in absolute terms. It's either 100% or 0%. And this document attempts to express the reality that these issues need to be nuanced to a certain degree to really get to biblical wisdom and biblical perspective on these things. And so it's important to say both yes and no. It's important to both deny and affirm. And so the whole format of the document, I think, grew out of the difficulties that our society and that many churches and that many believers are encountering by taking an all or nothing approach to many of these issues and their application to our lives.
I'm gonna share something. Give me your thoughts. All right. It seems to me that many times, and I'm not the only one to say this, the only one who's thought about this. But often churches and ministries will be committed to a doctrine, statement of faith, a confession of faith, or whatever, something like that, and it's agreed to in principle, and then one engages in ministry, various kinds and types of ministries, with very little thought given to your doctrinal foundation. So we give sort of abstract, tacit head nod to this, but we never really think about what are the implications from affirming this to then what we do in ministry or ministry expression or the various ministries in which we engage. And some have helped us to think whether it's something that combines the two is some in the past have called it a philosophy of ministry. More recently, people refer to it as a theological vision. That is to say, our doctrine is foundational, and then we carry these truths out in a context that then is foundational to the ministries in which we engage and how we engage in them. Honestly, I think that what was done this summer is sort of that middle piece that describes not just our doctrinal basis, our statement of faith, and our ministry expression over here, but the means by which that's going to be done. That's how I viewed that. Give me your thoughts on that.
I agree with that, Greg. I think what you said is right. I think that's what this document does reflect, and it reflects all of those things coming together in a certain way, and so we trust it's helpful on a theological basis, on a visionary basis, and a practical basis as well. So
Yeah.
And I do think, I mean, as it says in the summary and in the addendum, which again, I think the material around the 8 bullets is just as, if not more important than the bullet points themselves, that learning how to navigate cultural landscape and apply theology practically in life, which we do whether or not we acknowledge it and whether or not we actually incorporate the theology we claim. But to be able to do that without just falling into the all or nothing or getting fearful about things. And if something's new and we haven't heard it or understood it, automatically rejecting it, but instead being curious and asking good questions and finding things that we can say yes to and affirm, and not just but without doing just the classic, third way, middle of the road. I'm going to show the extremes and show that I'm in between them, but instead to be able to look through something and say, okay, what in this argument, what in this system of thought is good and worth retaining? Because there's going to be some truth there that we can affirm. But then also there's going to be, if it's not scripture and it's not the gospel, that we're going to find things that are contrary to scripture and contrary to the gospel. And so having the courage to be able to say, yes, there's something here, even if it's critiques and things that we haven't considered, or the critiques about the way that society has been, to be able to say, yeah, we can agree with that. We see that. And here's the way the gospel has the actual answer. And so that format and that understanding, my hope is that gives us a way to be able to navigate these things and actually bring our theology into our understanding of what's happening around us.
Yeah, that's very, very helpful. In the summary statements that were made, and I think that one, the introduction and the summary statements really are, I think they will perpetually be pertinent and relevant, and the bullets are going to come and go. But the introduction, the summary, and for the summary, just so that people understand, there are 4 paragraphs. In the first paragraph, it addresses the kingdom of God and the gospel of Jesus Christ, and that's ultimate. And final, and the ultimate and final solution. In the second paragraph, it's the gospel that creates a new community. That is the Church of Jesus Christ. And then for us in the EFCA, the third paragraph talks about our family of churches. And so it's very pertinent, relevant to us. And then the final one is in summary, that we identify who we are. Well, you both have talked about some of the significant implications of the summary statements and the addendum. Anything else that you would want to add on either one of those? Let me add this then. I think that what we're trying to get at here and how this is not sort of a via media. That is to say, you've got sorry, I'm going to use some big terms, but Hegelian dialectics, right? So you got the thesis and the antithesis, and then you combine these two things and you get the synthesis, and that's then the accurate place. And we're not. This is not a milquetoast, middle of the road, trying to placate, appease whomever. No, that's not it at all. This is recognizing biblical truth without reservation, without qualification, the faith once for all entrusted to the saints, but also then being willing to engage in what some call theological triage or what some call doctrinal rank. And I think sometimes in the Free Church, for us, it's been either an essential or a non-essential. That is an agree to disagree. And I think we've learned over the years that's somewhat almost too simplistic, that there needs to be more nuance. That is to say, if there's a first order, as Paul would say in 1 Corinthians 15, right? That which is of first importance, the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then he would say in Romans 14:1, well, now regarding those disputable matters, those matters about which we ought not to divide. But between these two, the biblical poles, right, the first order and disputable matters, there is a second order and there is a third order, a doctrine that we are attempting to address. And it seems to me that's the heart of what we're getting at in the summary statements and some of the sic et non. Would you agree?
Yeah, and even what you're saying, Greg, it makes me think about, if we're going to use Paul's letters as an example, that there is substance between the truth of the gospel, the application, and then the disputable matters that he says we offer grace on. When you see things like in Colossians 2, when he's saying, don't let anybody disqualify you or pass judgment on you when it comes to food or drink or festivals or new moon or Sabbath. And, all these things have the appearance of wisdom in promoting self-made religion, but they're of no value in restraining the flesh. And so to look at that and say, yeah, there are things that we need to look at and be able to understand what is being said and that actually do become important doctrinal points. But it's hard work. That's one of the barriers, is that it's hard work to continue to stay engaged and up to date on what's happening in the world around us, especially with how quick movements and ideologies are shifting and changing and how language changes so quickly as well. And so to be able to, and that's where I think too, as people read the bullet points, an important point of emphasis I would have is understanding how that summary and addendum are applied in what precedes it with the bullet points, because even there, in very short format, we attempted to bring definitional clarity to terms that are largely undefined, so that we need to understand and take note that the way that woke is defined here is not a universal definition of it, but we're calling out what we must deny and what we can and ought to affirm.
Yeah, that's helpful. Dave, anything to add?
I think that precisely because, as you say, Greg, the bullet points here in this document, at least in some measure, lie between the absolute affirmations of Scripture that we all agree on 100%, and the disputable matters, because they're in, to some degree, in a middle area. That's not true of every thing in this document, but there's room here for discussion. There's room for dialogue. Not everybody will see these bullet points exactly the same way. A case in point would be there's always room for more elaboration, and we had to keep the document, in a manageable length, and so we couldn't go into detail endlessly, obviously. But on the other hand, as you said, Bill, we had to say enough to try to make it clear and helpful and so on. So the document is certainly open to critique from different angles. It's certainly open to, it could always be improved. But we trust that overall it's helpful in spite of its inherent limitations. And we trust that it will be useful to free church pastors, church leaders, congregations, districts, and so on as time goes on.
Yeah, that's good.
Do you sense that this is one of the unique means? I do, but I'm going to ask the question. I think this is one of the strengths of the EFCA. So here's then my question. Do you think this is one of the means by which we can manifest our unity in the midst of some diversity? Not on the essentials. We're not talking about that, but sometimes it's diversity in application. Sometimes it's diversity of living something out. Do you sense that this? I don't want to say it's the best of, but it's an exemplar of how we in the EFCA. EFCA family live this truth out of unity in the midst of diversity.
Yeah, I definitely think so, Greg. I agree with you, and I think that something that I have appreciated about the EFCA. And when we were crafting this, we didn't know what the reception would be at the conference, and it's been overwhelmingly positive. But one of the things that has drawn me to and kept me in the EFCA over time is this posture of being able to have unity within diversity, and to be able to be clear about what the essentials are. I agree with you. I think sometimes the non-essential category has been twisted to mean that we don't even think about it, rather than thoughtful dialogue and theological triage. But my hope in this too is that in the EFCA, because of those factors, I think we have the ability to speak into things differently than some other movements might, because we have a grid through which we already are doing theological triage and trying to address and to stay engaged with the world around us. And fear and anxiety and division often comes and is increased by what is unknown and misunderstood. And so when there's mindsets and movements and language swirling around us, that can become like a boogeyman lurking in the dark corner in our bedroom that we're scared of. And as soon as we turn on the light and shed light on it and actually understand and try to understand together what the realities are, it takes a lot of that fear and anxiety away. And so my hope in what this statement was developed by both boards, what it does is that it actually represents where the majority of people in the EFCA already are. But that way it takes away the fear of, are we on this slippery slope or that slippery slope? And where is the EFCA going? And on things that we're not going anywhere on these issues.
We're standing firmly on biblical truth and the gospel of Jesus Christ.
And so ironically, my hope is that this statement makes it so that we don't have to talk about the statement much more. That it just establishes that most of our pastors in the EFCA, I think, really wish they could just do the work of pastoral ministry and preach the gospel and reach lost people and care for the sheep in their flock and not have to address all of the other stuff flying around us. And so trying to give handholds and clarity on that, I hope will bring greater freedom for unity across the movement.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I also am interested in this respect. Yes, pastors want to do that, Bill, preach and shepherd and care for God's people, but they're also needing help. I'm not saying that they're unable. I'm not. They're incompetent. Not at all. But we're on a treadmill of ministry, and I don't say that negatively. But that's just the reality. And I think most of our pastors are eagerly longing for, especially because they're part of the EFCA family, for some EFCA voice on some of these matters. And so in light of that, I'm interested in, Dave, you give me your thoughts. The response, when President Kevin Compline read this as his final statement in his presidential report at the conference, it was met with a standing ovation. What did that say? What did that communicate to you?
Yeah, I was present there, and it was a very meaningful moment for me personally, and I think it was very meaningful for almost all of the delegates who were present. This is just my take. I get that. I'm just speaking for myself here, but I like to think that that my thought here is perhaps representative of many others who were in the room, and you guys can chime in here too, and as to what you think. I think that standing ovation was expressing thoughts in the minds and hearts of the vast majority of delegates there along this line. Yes, of course, this is the EFCA I know. This is the EFCA I have known for many years. This is the EFCA that I have been hoping is still the EFCA that I know. And this is heartening to hear that representative leaders from the board of directors, the board of ministerial standing, and also the district superintendents. The district superintendents also signed off on the document. I just think it was heartening for the delegates to hear this representation of Free Church leaders affirming these things. So I think it brought clarity. I think it brought, just a renewed affirmation, a seconding of the motion, so to speak, of the free church that has served us all so well for all of these years, that we are still on track in that same ethos, those same commitments and values. And I think that's what gave the groundswell of support, at least in my view.
Yeah. You thought the same, Bill?
I did. It was a really powerful moment after being a part of the task force and the process of developing things, and again, unsure of how things would be received, and unsure if the EFCA that I've thought was actually there. And so I think there was a sense. I had a sense of relief and deeply, deeply encouraged about the direction of our movement and the unity of our movement. And so I think it was a very it ended up being more well received and and we've gotten more affirming feedback than even I expected.
I've sensed the same. In fact, it was overwhelming to me at the conference, and it's been subsequent to them as well. So as we close our time, just a couple of final thoughts, questions, etc. That is, so subsequent to the affirmation, the strong affirmation, the corporate yes at EFCA 1. Tell us a little bit, Bill, about your own experience in the church, and how you approached it with your own church family. And then, Dave, you are representative of a district. How it's been received in the district, if you would be willing to do that. Bill, why don't we begin with you in your own local church?
Yeah, in our local church, this has been especially helpful for our elders, and we have a Titus II team of women, and so our leadership community, our staff and deacons, to be able to walk through in great detail. And we made it available to the general church as well. For us, in part because of where we are, and in part because of what we've kind of established as an ethos as a church, this kind of approach and addressing issues like this document addresses wasn't out of character for our people to receive. And so it was, I think, for our people, more affirming of our place in the EFCA. And where I know that that's not the case everywhere, because we've built a culture here of taking the hard things on kind of head first and trying to lead people to some clarity on these hard, politicized, cultural.
And you've actually had to. I mean, if you didn't, it would be like you're seeking to minister in a context other than where you are.
Exactly. In the same way that Paul was interacting with the ideology in the marketplace in Athens, we are in a place that the currency is ideology, and so we've had to. So our church, in the way we use it, is probably a little different. It was more affirming of what our people are longing for. But my hope is for other churches that it would do that it would provide clarity and provide language for our pastors and leaders, that they might have just an understanding of how to begin to think about some of these issues. Like you said, not because they're incapable, but because there's only so much time, and none of us has the capacity to do all things all the time. And that it could be a reference for leaders, like it's been for us. And I know we've heard from some who are using this as a teaching resource and are teaching through these topics now. And my hope is that, again, the material around the 8 bullet points could even provide a template for pastors and leaders as they teach and lead their congregations through difficult things in the future, to be able to come back to it and say, well, what is it here that we can affirm? What are the things that we must deny? And how do we think about this issue in light of that? And so it gives a greater freedom to kind of lower the temperature on things and make it less scary. And so that's my hope of how it can be used for pastors and for leaders and in local churches. And again, it's not to say that everybody in the EFCA has agreed, wholesale with the whole document, but in general, I think that's the feedback we're getting.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Dave, just a district or the impact that you've found in the North Central.
One way that I'm using it in district ministry is I'm incorporating it now when I meet with pastoral search teams to train them in a pathway of searching for a new pastor. And one of the things that a search team needs to grapple with in today's world is how do we help, how do we discern whether this particular potential candidate for our church is really a fit, culturally, socially, politically, theologically, and so on. In today's volatile culture, how do we know that this pastor is going to fit into our church culture? And how do we explore that in ways that are thorough enough to be helpful? And yet, how do we sort of deal with some of these dicey issues? And so I've begun to use this document now, and I tell search teams the background and how it came about and so on. And I do tell them, I say, now, this is not binding. Okay, this, as you mentioned earlier, Greg, this is not binding on you. And I tell them that because some free churches will they'll bristle a little bit at the thought of a top-down kind of a thing. And so I try to reassure them so that they have space to consider this on its own merits. And I say, but I think you'll find it helpful as a statement that's representative of many, many leaders in the free church. And this may be a helpful tool for you to pass on to potential candidates and engage in dialogue with them. How do you see these things? Does this document of where we stand in the free church, does it reflect your own personal convictions? So I think it will be an ongoing helpful tool to churches as they search for new pastors. And that, of course, can bring a lot of good fruit long term.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems to me that in many of those instances, Dave, that asking if there's doctrinal agreement is not the only thing about which we should ask. That's fundamental. But there can be a strong agreement on that and very differing views that are pretty strong on some of the other issues. And if some of those are not addressed or understood or probed a little bit, it can end up in divisions or differences of thought that can become pretty significant in a context of a local church. So that's very encouraging. One last question. So if a pastor, elder, leader out there is asking, is wondering, boy, I've read the document, I like the document. What recommendations would you give for me to begin having this conversation, or a pastor in the church? What recommendations would you give? How do I go about? What counsel would you give to carry on the conversation, which we've established is important and helpful? What counsel might you give? Dave, let's begin with you.
I think of a couple spheres in which it could be helpful. The sphere of church staff, if there's a multiple staff of the church, that could be a helpful sphere in which to begin a discussion based on this document, or it could be the group of elders or the group of deacons or a leadership team in the church. Can also be helpful spheres. We've mentioned, Sunday school class and so on. These can be spheres of potential discussion that could be helpful. And I think maybe one other piece of counsel I would give is I do think it is helpful just to assure people that this document provides guidance, it provides counsel, it provides a basis for grappling with these issues, but it's not a binding policy, and so that gives some room. That gives some room for discussion. And in some of these bullet points, there is not room for differences. We have our conviction, our biblical conviction, for example, on the nature of hell. and that's not up for dialogue. But other aspects of the document require further discussion and dialogue for applying things, racial reconciliation, practical, concrete ways of making progress in that, practical, concrete ways of ministering to people with true, issues of gender, and so on. So offering this document as a basis for discussion and dialogue, I think, can be a helpful way to go about.
Bill, the last word.
Yeah, I agree with with what Dave is saying, to use this as a starting point for helpful dialogue with staff and leaders in various groups. And again, this is where I would again point to the posture of the document, that my hope is that pastors, leaders, whether you're teaching a Sunday school class or a community group or home Bible fellowship or whatever venue you're in, that if leaders can take this and have that kind of a grid to understand that there's a way to engage in things that isn't just reactionary, and there's a way to engage that doesn't play into partisan talking points and divides, and to have a holy curiosity to be able to learn as much as we can about the way that people think and give them the best benefit of the doubt we can, and learn what can we, ask good questions and listen and do what we can to find common ground, whether it's critique or end goals. We might have the same end goal for things, but it's just a completely different means through Christ. Or it could be that the end goal is where we disagree, and there might be some other
that's right.
things. So
that's right.
But just a posture for things. And my hope is that this would encourage folks to be able to begin to work this kind of approach into the life of their church in an openness this way, from the pulpit, from various venues, to be able to say, we don't have to be scared to address critical race theory. And we're not going to solve it. And we might not even be able to figure out how everyone's defining it, but let's find out what we can say, and let's lean into learning what we can learn. And so that would be my hope for above everything, is that this can help our pastors and church leaders overall in a bigger picture to have a grid to be able to engage in important cultural issues that are the theological implications of what we say we believe.
Yeah. Yes, thank you. And that really, when these bullets change, when they change, they will. The other things remain, in a sense, a constant. That is we're going to, we've got the foundation, and as I often like to say, tethered to the text of Scripture and grounded in the gospel of Jesus Christ. That doesn't change, and so we can be thankful for that.
I've had one of our members that saw the statement and came in with some concerns and about some of the denials side, which we led with here, and
there was a reason for that, as you remember.
Yeah. But it came in and said, but on the affirmation side, I can agree with everything. And I was able to say, that's great. That's the more important thing, because even within these statements, what's going to change is the denial side. The language, the issues are going to change. But on the affirmation side, we do see a need to be awakened to the global and indeed cosmic impact of sin, including racial injustice, and to be attuned to the biblical call for gospel-driven efforts toward reconciliation and restoration. That part isn't going to change. And so the affirmations here actually are more important and more long-standing than the denials. The denials are the part that's going to shift over time.
Yep.
And so I hope as people read this document and utilize this document, that's something that can be grasped as well. That in an ever-changing world, that changes ever more quickly, that there are things that we are going to cling to, that we can stand on. And along the way, that makes it so we don't have to be afraid of the issues that come up.
Yeah. Well, thank you to both of you. We are grateful, very grateful for your ministry in the context of a local church in the district. Bill, as chair of the board of directors, and Dave, as chair of the board of ministerial standing, we are very grateful, and we rejoice and give thanks to the Lord for how he worked in both boards and your leadership to bring about this document, Where We Stand in the EFCA, Denials and Affirmations. Thank you. May the Lord bless you, brother.
Thank you, Greg.